The snow started falling just after midnight, and Nora Bellamy was the only person on Maple Hollow Street who noticed the man sitting on the curb like he had nowhere left to go. She had just finished her shift at the Ashford estate 3 blocks over, her knees aching from 6 hours of scrubbing floors that weren't hers and polishing silver she would never eat off of, and she was walking home the way she always did, hands stuffed into the pockets of a coat that had seen better winters. That was when she saw the suitcases. 2 of them, black and expensive, sitting in a pile of snow beside a cardboard box that had clearly been packed in anger, its flaps hanging open, a silk tie spilling out onto the frozen sidewalk like something wounded. The man sitting beside the pile had his elbows on his knees and his head down, black hair falling forward, and for a moment Nora almost kept walking, because in this neighborhood a man sitting alone at midnight was not always a man worth stopping for. But something about the stillness of him stopped her feet before her mind caught up. He was not drunk. He was not afraid. He was simply still, the way a blade is still before it's used, and when he finally lifted his head and looked at her, she understood immediately that this was not a man accustomed to being looked at with pity. His eyes were dark and sharp, rimmed with exhaustion he was fighting to hide, and along his forearm, where his white dress shirt had ridden up past his wrist, she caught the edge of ink, black lines disappearing under the fabric like a secret he hadn't meant to show her. He did not ask for help. He did not explain himself. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided is not his problem to accept, and said nothing at all. Nora had grown up in this city watching men like her father work themselves into early graves for people who never said thank you, and something about the pride in this stranger's spine, even now, even here, on a curb in the snow with his life in 2 suitcases beside him, reminded her of that same stubborn dignity. "You're going to freeze," she said, because it was the truest thing she could think to say. He looked up at her again, longer this time, cataloging her the way she imagined he cataloged everyone, the frayed hem of her coat, the exhaustion in her own face, the calluses she knew were visible on her hands even in the dark. "I'm aware," he said. His voice was low, controlled, and carried no accent she could place beyond a certain precision, every word chosen like it cost him something to spend it. She should have walked on. She told herself later that she almost did. But she thought of her grandmother, who used to say that the Lord tested you in strange ways and on stranger nights, and she thought of the extra room in her house that had sat empty since her brother moved to Ohio 2 winters ago, and, before she could talk herself out of it, she said the words that would change both of their lives. "You can stay with me. Just for tonight. I don't have much, but I have a roof, and it doesn't leak." He stared at her like she had spoken a language he didn't recognize. "You don't know me," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I know what a man looks like when he has nowhere else to go, and you look like that." Something moved behind his eyes then, quick and unreadable, gone before she could name it. "Haruto," he said finally, as if the name cost him something too. "Haruto Ishikawa." "Nora," she said. "Nora Bellamy. Now pick up your bags before we both turn into icicles." He did not thank her as they walked, and she did not expect him to. There was something in the careful way he carried himself, the way his eyes swept the street corners even in his exhaustion, cataloging exits and shadows, that told her this was a man used to watching for danger, not gratitude. Her house was small, a shotgun row home with a porch that sagged on one side and a radiator that clanked like it was arguing with itself, but it was warm, and it was hers, paid for in a decade of scrubbing other people's floors. She showed him to the spare room without ceremony, gave him a spare blanket that had belonged to her grandmother, and told him the bathroom was down the hall, if he wanted to wash up. He stood in the doorway of that small room for a long moment, looking at the narrow bed and the water-stained ceiling like he was recalibrating something in his mind, some understanding of the world that had just been quietly rearranged. "Why?" he asked, not turning around. "Why does it matter?" she said. "You needed somewhere warm. I had somewhere warm. That's the whole equation." "Nothing is ever the whole equation," he said, and there was something old in the way he said it, something that had been carved into him long before tonight. She didn't press him. She had learned a long time ago that people told you what they needed to tell you when they were ready, and not a moment before. "Get some sleep, Haruto," she said, and closed the door behind her, and lay awake for a long time in her own bed listening to the house settle around a stranger, wondering what kind of man loses everything on a Tuesday and still holds his shoulders like a king. By morning he was already awake when she came downstairs, sitting at her small kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he'd apparently made himself, still in yesterday's clothes, his hair damp from a shower. He looked less like a man who'd been thrown out onto the street, and more like something coiled, waiting. "You made coffee," she said, surprised. "It seemed rude not to contribute something," he said, and there was the faintest suggestion of dry humor in it, the first crack in the armor she'd seen. She poured herself a cup and sat across from him, studying him in the daylight the way she hadn't been able to in the dark. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe mid-30s, with a face that would have been called handsome by anyone with eyes, sharp-boned and severe, softened only by a mouth that looked like it had once known how to smile before it forgot. The ink at his wrist crept further than she'd realized, dark lines suggesting something larger hidden beneath his sleeve, a story written in a language she couldn't read. "I have to be at the Ashford house by 8, she said. "You're welcome to stay here today. There's food in the icebox, not much, but enough. I'll be back by 6. He watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, not with fear exactly, but with the awareness of being seen fully for the first time in longer than she could remember. "You're not going to ask me what I did," he said. "To end up on a curb with my life in 2 suitcases. "I figure you'll tell me if you want to," she said, standing, gathering her things. "And if you don't, that's your business, not mine. I didn't invite you in to interrogate you. I invited you in because it was cold." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped lower, more careful. "That is either the most foolish thing anyone has done for me, or the only wise thing anyone has done for me in a very long time. I have not yet decided which." "Maybe it's both," she said, and left for work before he could answer, though she felt the weight of his eyes on her back all the way to the door. The truth, though she did not know it yet, was heavier than anything she could have guessed. Haruto Ishikawa had, until 11 days ago, controlled the entirety of the port district, a network of warehouses and shipping routes and quiet arrangements that had made him one of the most powerful men in a city that did not print his name in any paper. He had built that empire on a foundation of discipline and silence, the same discipline that had been drilled into him since he was young enough to hold a blade steady, the same silence that had been his only companion in the years after he lost the one person who had ever made him feel like something other than a weapon. Her name had been Sachiko. She had been the daughter of a rival family, and their fathers had brought them together as children in an arrangement of alliance, and somewhere in the years that followed, what had started as strategy had become something neither of them had asked for and both of them had needed. She had died 8 years ago, in a car that had been meant for him, a message from an enemy who had understood that killing her would hurt him more than any bullet aimed at his own chest. He had not touched another woman with intention since, had built walls so thick around that particular room of himself that even his own men had stopped expecting to see him smile. And then, 11 days ago, a man he had trusted for over a decade, his own second in command, a man named Run who had eaten at his table more times than either of them could count, had drained his accounts, seized his warehouses through a series of forged documents, and sold his loyalty to the Takeda family for a price Haruto still didn't know, because knowing would mean understanding exactly how little his life had been worth to the one person he'd let close enough to betray him. He had been given 24 hours to vacate the penthouse that was no longer his accounts frozen, his soldiers reassigned or disappeared, his empire dismantled with the same surgical precision he had once used to build it. He had walked out with 2 suitcases and the clothes he stood in, and he had sat down on a curb because for the first time in 15 years, he had genuinely not known where to go next. That was the moment everything changed, though neither of them understood it yet, when a maid with tired eyes and a warm house had looked at him like he was a person and not a threat or a target or a transaction. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them expected. Haruto did not leave the house at first, not out of fear exactly, but out of the calculated stillness of a man waiting to understand the shape of the danger still circling him. He used the hours to make calls on a burner phone he'd bought with the last of his cash, quiet conversations Nora overheard fragments of when she came home early one evening, words like territory and debt, and the traitor spoken in a voice so flat and cold it made the hair on her arms rise.
She did not ask him about it.
But she noticed the way he positioned himself near windows, always with a clear line to the door, the way his eyes tracked every car that slowed on her street, the way he flinched almost imperceptibly at the sound of her neighbor's door slamming one evening, a reaction gone so fast she might have imagined it if she hadn't been watching him so closely by then. "You're not just a businessman who fell on hard times," she said one night, setting a plate of rice and stewed greens in front of him, the kind of food her grandmother used to make, simple and full. He looked at the plate for a long moment before looking at her. "No," he admitted. "I am not. Are you going to tell me what you are? Would you still let me stay if I did?" She considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things. "I don't know," she said. "But I'd rather know the truth and decide than be kept in the dark and used." Something shifted in his face then, a kind of respect she hadn't expected to earn so easily. "I was the head of an organization," he said carefully, watching her reaction with the precision of a man reading a room for exits. "The kind that does not appear in newspapers with polite names. I built something out of nothing, and 11 days ago, a man I trusted took it from me and left me with nothing to show for 15 years of my life." Nora set down her fork slowly. "A crime family," she said. "Yes. And the men who did this to you, are they still looking for you?" "They believe I am no longer a threat," he said. "Which means, for now, they are not looking very hard. That will change." She should have been afraid. Some rational, self-preserving part of her understood that she should have asked him to leave that very night, should have called someone, should have done any number of sensible things. Instead, she found herself asking the question that mattered more to her than any of it. "Did you hurt people who didn't deserve it?" He met her eyes without flinching. "I have done things I am not proud of. I will not pretend otherwise to make myself easier for you to trust. But I have never harmed someone who is not already trying to harm me or mine, and I have never touched an innocent person to make a point." It wasn't absolution. It wasn't even close. But it was honest, and Nora had spent her whole life around people who lied smoothly and easily, and something about the rough, unpolished truth of him made her trust him more than the lie would have. The danger arrived on a Thursday, 9 days after that first snowy night, in the form of a black sedan that idled too long outside Nora's house while she was walking home from the bus stop. She noticed it because Haruto had taught her, without meaning to, the small tells of a threat, and the sedan's engine ran too smooth and too quiet for this neighborhood, its windows tinted darker than the law allowed. She quickened her pace without running, the way he'd shown her without either of them acknowledging it was a lesson, and slipped through her own front door with her heart hammering. Haruto was already moving before she finished explaining, crossing the small living room in 3 strides, pulling her back from the window with a hand that was gentle even in its urgency. "How many?" he said. "1 car. 2 men, I think. Stay low. Stay away from the windows." His voice had changed entirely, stripped of every softness she'd started to hear in it over the past week, replaced by something cold and absolute, a general assessing a battlefield. He moved to the back of the house, checked the door, checked the small window over the kitchen sink, his body language transformed into something economical and lethal, and Nora understood in that moment, watching him, that she was seeing the man he had been before the curb, before the coffee he made without being asked, before he'd started leaving the last piece of bread for her, because he'd noticed she liked the crust. This was the version of him that had built an empire, and it should have terrified her. Instead, watching the way he positioned his body slightly in front of hers without her even noticing him do it, she felt something else entirely, something dangerous and warm that she refused to name. The sedan pulled away 20 minutes later without incident, but the message had been delivered all the same. They had found him. It was only a matter of time before they understood he was not alone. "You need to leave," Haruto said that night, standing in her kitchen with his jaw tight.
"Tonight."
"Somewhere safe. Family, a friend, anywhere that is not connected to me." "This is my house," Nora said. "I'm not running from my own kitchen." They will use you against me if they realize what you've become to this situation. The word hung between them, unfinished, and neither of them reached to complete it. And what have I become? She said quietly, daring him to answer. He looked at her for a long moment, something raw moving behind his careful control. Someone I cannot afford to lose, he said finally, the words dragged out of him like they cost more than anything he'd spent in 15 years. And that is precisely why you should leave. No, she said, and it was not defiance for its own sake. It was a decision, clear-eyed and deliberate. You've spent this whole week protecting me without me asking you to. Let me make my own choice for once. I'm not running from a threat that exists because I decided to be decent to a stranger in the snow. That's not how I live my life. He crossed the space between them before either of them seemed to decide he would, close enough that she could see the exhaustion and the want and the fear all tangled together in his dark eyes. You do not understand what these people are capable of.
Then tell me, she said.
Stop protecting me from the truth and start trusting me with it. I've earned that much, haven't I? He exhaled slowly, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped to something quieter, something that felt like it had been locked away for 8 long years. I had someone once, he said. Her name was Sachiko. She was not involved in any of it, not truly. She simply loved a man who was, and that was enough for my enemies to take her from me to send a message. I have spent 8 years making certain that message was the last mistake anyone made against me. And now I have nothing left to protect anyone with, and the idea of history repeating itself in your kitchen, in your house, because you were kind to me on a night when kindness cost you nothing you thought you had to lose, that is a weight I do not know how to carry. Nora felt something crack open in her chest, not pity, something closer to recognition. I'm not her, she said gently. And I'm not asking you to protect me the way you couldn't protect her. I'm asking you to trust that I can make my own choices, the same way you're making yours. You are the first person in longer than I can remember who has looked at me and seen something other than a title or a threat, he said, the words coming slower now, like each one required him to set down a piece of armor he'd worn so long he'd forgotten it wasn't skin. I told myself, that first night, that letting you help me was simply survival. I have been lying to myself for 9 days. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything neither of them had said yet, and when he reached out and touched her face, his hand rough and careful all at once, she did not pull away. She should have been more cautious after that night. She knew it even as it happened, even as the line between rescuer and something far more dangerous blurred past any point of return. But 3 days later, when one of Haruto's few remaining loyal contacts, a woman named Fumiko who ran a restaurant in the old district, reached out with information about where the traitor was hiding, Nora made the choice that would change the shape of everything that followed. Haruto wanted to go alone. Of course he did. If I walk into that building and something goes wrong, at least only I am at risk, he said, checking a weapon she had known he still possessed, tucked into a bag beneath the floorboard of her spare room. That's not your decision to make alone anymore, Nora said, and there was steel in her voice that surprised even her. You need someone who can walk into a room and not be recognized as a threat. I clean the Ashford estate. I know how to be invisible in rooms full of powerful people who've stopped seeing me as a person years ago. Let me use that. Absolutely not, he said. It is too dangerous. Everything about this is dangerous, Haruto. The question is whether you're going to let me help you the way I let you stay in my house that first night, or whether you're going to shut me out the same way everyone else in your life apparently has. It was a low blow, and she knew it the moment she said it, but it landed exactly where she meant it to. He was quiet for a long moment, jaw working, and then he nodded once, sharp and final. You do exactly what I say when I say it.
No deviations. Fin.
I mean it, Nora. I said fine, Haruto. The building where Run had been hiding was a converted warehouse near the docks, guarded loosely by men who had clearly grown complacent in their new positions of stolen power. Nora walked in wearing the plain gray uniform she wore to the Ashford estate, carrying a delivery bag Fumiko had prepared, playing the role of an anonymous woman bringing food to men who had stopped looking twice at anyone who wasn't a threat. She moved through the building's ground floor exactly as Haruto had instructed, memorizing exits, counting guards, Noting the location of the room where voices carried through a thin wall, one of them unmistakably the calm, cultured voice of the man who had stolen 15 years of Haruto's life. What Haruto hadn't planned for, what neither of them could have planned for, was the moment one of the guards recognized her not as a delivery girl but as the woman who had been seen leaving Nora Bellamy's house on Maple Hollow Street, a detail some careless soldier had reported back without understanding its significance until this exact moment. The guard's hand went to his weapon, and Nora's mind moved faster than her fear. Years of reading dangerous rooms in wealthy houses where a wrong word could cost her a job kicking in with startling clarity. She dropped the delivery bag, let it spill open, cans rolling across the floor in a clatter of noise and confusion, and in the half-second of chaos that bought her, she drove her elbow into the guard's throat with a force that surprised even herself, a move she'd learned years ago in a self-defense class she'd taken after a bad encounter on a late bus ride home, a skill she'd never expected to need again. He went down choking, and she was already moving, already shouting the signal word Haruto had given her, already reaching for the second guard's wrist as he lunged for her, twisting hard enough to hear something pop, buying herself 3 more seconds that felt like an hour. Haruto came through the side entrance like violence given a human shape, and Nora understood in that moment exactly what people meant when they said he moved like the room owed him space. He was economical and precise, each movement stripped of anything wasted, disarming one man with emotion so fast she almost missed it, driving forward toward the room where Ren waited with 2 more soldiers flanking him, men who had once called Haruto their leader and now looked at him like a problem to be solved. Ren himself stood at the center of it all, composed in a way that made Nora's skin crawl, a man who had eaten at Haruto's table and smiled at him and planned his destruction in the same breath. "You should have stayed gone," Ren said, and his voice was exactly as calm as it had been through the wall, a man entirely unbothered by the chaos of his own soldiers falling around him. "I bill half of what you stole," Haruto said, and his voice had gone somewhere flat and terrible, a register Nora had never heard from him. "You didn't take an empire from me, Ren. You took the last thing I trusted." "Sentiment," Ren said, almost pitying. "That was always your weakness. Sachiko taught you nothing." The name hit the room like a blade, and Nora watched something in Haruto go very, very still, the stillness that came before violence, not after it. But it was Nora who moved first this time, stepping between the space where Ren's hand had drifted toward a weapon on the table beside him, using the same forward momentum that had served her in the outer room, closing the distance before the man could fully register a threat from a woman he had dismissed as irrelevant the moment she'd walked in. She was not as strong as him, not as trained, but she did not need to win the fight. She only needed to disrupt it, and the heavy metal tray she swung from the nearby table caught his arm hard enough to send the weapon skittering across the floor, buying Haruto the half-second he needed. What happened after that was fast and brutal and precise. Haruto's years of discipline finally unleashed on the man who had spent them stealing everything Haruto had built, and Nora did not look away, because looking away would have meant pretending she didn't understand exactly what world she had chosen to stand in when she'd offered a stranger her spare room. When it was over, Ren was alive but broken, restrained and disarmed. His empire of borrowed power collapsed as quickly as it had been built on betrayal. Haruto stood over him breathing hard, and for a moment Nora thought she was looking at a stranger, some cold and lethal architecture of a man she hadn't fully understood until this exact instant. Then he turned to find her, and his eyes swept over her face and her hands and the small cut along her forearm from the shattered tray, and whatever coldness had lived in his expression a moment before dissolved into something raw and unguarded, something that looked almost like fear finally allowed to surface, now that the danger had passed. "You could have died," he said, closing the distance between them in 3 strides.
"So could you," she said.
"We're even. This is not a joke, Nora." "I'm not laughing," she said, and her voice cracked on the words in a way that surprised her, all the adrenaline of the last 10 minutes finally catching up to her body. "I was terrified. I am still terrified. But I wasn't going to stand outside and wait to find out if you were coming back to me or not." He reached for her then, both hands framing her face with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the violence still humming through his body, and he said her name the way he had never said it before, not once in 9 days of careful distance, low and certain, and stripped of every wall he'd built around himself for 8 long years. Nora. Just that. Just her name, spoken like a claim and a confession all at once, and she understood in that single word everything he had not yet found the courage to say aloud. The city's underworld reorganized itself in the days that followed, as it always does when power changes hands, and Haruto, with what remained of his loyal contacts and the leverage of Ren's confession recorded and secured by Fumiko before Nora had even entered the building, began the slow, deliberate work of reclaiming what had been stolen from him. It was not clean. It was not easy. There were more tense nights, more careful negotiations conducted in low voices behind Nora's kitchen table while she made tea and pretended not to listen and listened anyway, because she had long since stopped pretending this wasn't her fight too. But the immediate threat, the sedan outside her window, the soldiers who might come looking for the maid who had sheltered a fallen boss, all of it began to recede as Haruto's reputation reasserted itself through channels Nora didn't fully understand and didn't need to. What she understood instead was simpler and far more important. She understood the way he'd started reaching for her hand without thinking about it, the way he'd started leaving small things around her house that suggested a man settling somewhere rather than passing through, a specific brand of tea he preferred, a second toothbrush by the sink that neither of them had discussed, but both of them had accepted. 3 weeks after that first snowy night, with most of his territory reclaimed and the immediate danger dismantled piece by careful piece, Haruto found her in the kitchen on a quiet evening, the radiator clanking its familiar argument in the background, and he did something she had never once seen him do in all the time she'd known him. He hesitated. "I have spent 15 years building an empire," he said finally, standing in the doorway like he wasn't entirely certain he was welcome to enter, though they both knew he was. "I told myself that was the whole of what I wanted from this life. Control and territory, and the illusion of safety that comes from being feared instead of loved. I was wrong. I understood I was wrong the moment you told a stranger on a curb that he could stay with you, expecting nothing in return." "I wasn't trying to teach you a lesson, Haruto," Nora said, setting down the dish towel in her hands. "I was just trying to keep a man from freezing." "I know," he said, and there was something almost like wonder in his voice. "That is precisely why it mattered. Everyone else in my life has wanted something from me. Territory, loyalty, protection, fear. You wanted nothing. You still want nothing, and I do not know what to do with a person who asks for nothing and gives everything regardless." "Maybe you don't have to do anything with it," she said gently. "Maybe you just accept it. I do not know how to be soft, Nora. I have spent too long being the opposite." "I'm not asking you to be soft," she said, crossing the small kitchen to stand in front of him, close enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating off him even through the space still between their bodies. "I'm asking you to be honest. That's all I've ever asked of you." He looked down at her for a long moment, something settling in his face that she hadn't seen there before, not the stillness of a man waiting to strike, but the stillness of a man who had finally stopped running from something he wanted. "I do not have very much to offer you," he said. "My empire is smaller now than it was, and rebuilding it will take years, and there will always be men like Ren who see kindness as weakness to be exploited. I cannot promise you safety in any way that means something. I can only promise you the truth, and the truth is that I did not survive that night on the curb because of luck. I survived it because a woman with tired eyes and an empty spare room decided I was worth the risk of kindness. I have thought of very little else since." Nora reached up and rested her palm against his chest, feeling the steady, controlled rhythm of his heart beneath her hand, a rhythm that had learned, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, to beat a little less like armor and a little more like something alive. "Then don't promise me safety," she said. "Promise me honesty. I can build a life around that." He said her name once more, low and certain, the same way he had said it in that warehouse with blood still on his knuckles and fear only now catching up to relief, and this time when he closed the distance between them, there was no danger circling outside the door, no threat waiting in a parked car, nothing left standing between them except the choice they were both finally ready to make. He kissed her like a man setting down a weapon he had carried for 8 years, careful and deliberate, and entirely without the caution that had governed every other part of his life. And when she kissed him back, hands fisting gently in the fabric of his shirt, it was not a rescue, and it was not a debt being repaid. It was simply two people who had found each other in the coldest part of the year and decided, deliberately, with open eyes, that they were not interested in letting go. The radiator clanked on in the background, arguing with itself the way it always did, and neither of them paid it any mind at all, because for the first time in longer than either could remember, the small, imperfect house on Maple Hollow Street did not feel like a place either of them was simply passing through. It felt, quietly and without ceremony, like the beginning of somewhere they both intended to stay. If this story kept you up past your bedtime, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one, and drop a comment telling me which line hit you the hardest, because I read every single one of them and I love hearing which moments stayed with you the longest. Until next time, stay warm out there.